comment.
Well, thank you very much. I'm Professor Walter Williams. I teach economics at George Mason University. I've done so for 35 years, and it's a delight for me to be here to just to kind of give us some ideas to think about in terms of nullification. And I think one of the things we might want to think of is, should we obey all laws? And when I say that, I say, I ask the question, suppose you were a juror during the 1850s, and a free person was on trial, charged with assisting a runaway slave in clear violation of the Fugitive Slave Act that Congress enacted in 1850. Would you convict and punish the person? Clearly, the Fugitive Slave Act was constitutional because in Abelman versus Booth in 1859, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled it so. That court decision, as well as some others in our past, makes the case that moral and decent people cannot rely solely on the courts to establish what's right and what's wrong. Slavery is immoral. Therefore, any laws that would aid and abet are also moral or immoral. Thomas Jefferson warned us that to consider the judges as the ultimate arbiters of all constitutional questions is a very dangerous doctrine. Indeed, a doctrine which would place us under the despotism of an oligarchy. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that Obamacare is constitutional, even though it exceeds the enumerated powers of Congress. In addition, there are questions raised with the Obamacare about the role that government should play in our lives. That is, the court ruling establishes a precedent where if Congress calls its dictate a tax, they can control under the penalty of fines and imprisonment any aspect of our lives that they wish. For example, Congress might tell us to join a fitness club in the name of good health. And if we don't obey, a tax penalty is levied. I think that state governors and legislators ought to summon up the kind of courage of our founders, the kind of courage that our founders had in response to the 5th U.S. Congress Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. The Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798 and 1799 were drafted, where the legislatures took the position that the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional. They said, and I quote, "Resolved that the several states composing the United States of America are not united on the principle of unlimited submission to their general government. And whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force." The 10th Amendment to our Constitution supports that vision. And for those of us who do not remember, the 10th Amendment says, "Powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Congress has already gone far beyond the powers delegated to it by the United States Constitution. And one way we can see this is that in the Federalist Papers that debated the Constitution. And in Federalist Paper 45, which I'd urge you to read, Madison explained what the powers of the Constitution were. And he said, quote, "The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined, and restricted mostly to external affairs. Those left with the people and the states are indefinite and numerous." Now, if you turn that vision upside down, we have what we have today. The powers of the federal government are indefinite and undefined, and those of the states and the people are restricted. And you might just ask yourself, what can the state of South Carolina do without federal permission? Now, people might respond to calls for nullification by saying, the last time the states got into this nullification business, it led to a war that cost 600,000 lives. But I think things are different this time. First, most Americans are against Obamacare. And secondly, I don't believe that you can find many American soldiers who would follow a presidential order to descend upon a state to round up and shoot down fellow Americans because they refuse to follow a congressional order to buy health insurance. But even so, we should heed the warning of the former slave, Frederick Douglass, who said, and I quote him, "Find out just what people will submit to, and you have found out the exact amount of injustice and wrong which can be imposed upon them. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress." Now, some people might argue, some of you might argue, some attorneys might argue, that the General Welfare Clause of the Constitution grants Congress to dictate our health care. Permit me to give you some of the statements of the founders about the General Welfare Clause. First, with respect to the two words general welfare, I have always regarded them as qualified by the detail of powers connected with them. To take them in a literal and unlimited sense would be a metamorphosis of the Constitution into a character which there's a host of proofs not contemplated by its creators. That was James Madison, the acknowledged father of the United States Constitution. Thomas Jefferson said, "Congress has not unlimited powers to provide for the general welfare, but only those specifically enumerated." Another statement by Madison, "If Congress can do whatever in their discretion can be done by money and promote the general welfare, the government is no longer a limited one possessing enumerated powers, but an indefinite one." That was James Madison's letter to Edmund Pendleton. Finally, but not from our founders, but from your former state senator, that is Senator William Drayton of 1828. He said, if Congress can determine what constitutes the general welfare and can appropriate money for its advancement, where is the limitation to carrying on the execution of whatever can be effected by money? Now, the words and warnings of the founders about nullification and limitations on government might mean very little to many Americans of the day. But let me just cite some of them. They pointed out that the purpose of a written constitution, that's what Thomas Jefferson said, the purpose of a written constitution is to bind up the several branches of government by certain laws. Thomas Jefferson also said the greatest calamity which could befall us would be the submission to a government of unlimited powers. The powers of the federal government are enumerated. It can only operate in certain cases. It has legislative powers on defined and limited objects, beyond which it cannot extend its jurisdiction. That was James Madison. I'm quite sure he was not thinking about Obamacare. Let me just point out one thing in conclusion, just to give you an idea of the kind of contempt that has been exhibited by our fellow Americans for our founding, or the contrast that we make with our founders, is that in 1794, Congress appropriated $15,000 to help some French refugees who fled from insurrection in San Domingo to Baltimore and Philadelphia. James Madison stood on the floor of the House irate to object to this appropriation of $15,000. And he said, and I quote, "I cannot undertake to lay my finger on that article of the Constitution which granted a right to Congress of expending on the objects of benevolence the money of their constituents." Now, if you look at the federal budget today, 2/3 to 3/4 of it is spent on the objects of benevolence. And isn't it tragic that any president will be running for office today who took a stance like James Madison, he would be run out of town on a rail. Now, this is something that we have to, these ideas of liberty and limited government is something that we have to resurrect for our future generations. It's not a question of whether this government health care is a good idea or a bad idea. That's not the question at all. The question is it permissible by the United States Constitution? That's what we should look at. The true tragedy today is that today's Americans do not know and appreciate the wisdom of our founders, the kind of wisdom that made us a rich and powerful country in the first place. Thank you very much.
Any questions from the committee? Any questions from Mr. Williams? Representative Pope.
Mr. Williams, I know you kind of looked at the various nullification aspects around the country that you've seen as you've been speaking on this. Is there a particular form that you see it take? Because I'm with you on what you said. We're just tasked now with figuring out what we can do with it as a state. And one of the concerns I've had with the current bill was arresting federal officers for enforcing federal law. Have you seen that occur in other circumstances, or do you believe that's the proper course I was thinking about your fugitive slave example. Of course, you hadn't been placed as a juror in that matter, but if I was a state officer at that time, the feds had made a determination. If a federal officer made an arrest, would you then see the state would then arrest the federal officer?
Well, I'm not sure about that. I have no expertise in that particular area, but I think that it's a moral question, and it has something to do with if you are an official of a state and you see anybody doing anything that runs contrary to the state laws and regulations, then I think that you're duty bound to take some kind of action against them.
Okay, and using the example that comes to mind, I guess in essence, whether there's interposition or nullification, like in Colorado with the marijuana law, the day may come that the DEA may choose to go there. I don't think the feds will waste their time doing it, but they could go and arrest somebody for marijuana. Would you envision then that it would be appropriate for Colorado to arrest the federal officers for enforcing that federal law?
Well, if they violated Colorado law, yes. Yes, arrest them.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Any other questions? Representative Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Professor Williams, I want to ask you a couple of questions about the bill, H 3101. Have you read the bill?
I read it.
Okay. And enjoyed a lot of what you presented to us today. Good information. What is your position on the bill? Should we or should we not pass this bill?
I think you should pass.
So you're advocating?
I think that maybe not in terms of the particular. My view is that I think that the state representatives of South Carolina should do those things that are constitutional and not do those things that are unconstitutional. And I think the wording is clear in the United States Constitution. There's just no authority for it whatsoever.
And it's your opinion here today, and before this committee, that what is being proposed, H 3101, is in fact constitutional.
Well, it's at least moral. It's not constitutional.
So you don't have an opinion as to whether or not it's constitutional?
Well, I think it's a question of whether it adheres to South Carolina's Constitution.
But you don't have an opinion as to whether or not it adheres to South Carolina's Constitution?
No, I'm not an expert in that area.
Okay.
I'll let my colleague respond to that question.
Okay. I look forward to asking him the same questions. So you are advocating that this subcommittee pass this legislation?
Yes.
And earlier when we were asking you some questions, I think my colleague Representative Pope asked you a question about whether or not we should arrest federal officers for enforcing federal law. And your response, I believe, was that you were not an expertise in this area. Does that change your opinion at all about passing this legislation, which would require us to do that? Are you now saying that you have some knowledge in that area that would be an appropriate course of action for the state of South Carolina to take?
Well, I think that you're asking me some details that that's not in my area of expertise. But what I came here to testify was some of the moral and some of the constitutional issues, and trying to get legislators and governors to summon up the kind of courage that the founders had in not going along with measures that they viewed as unconstitutional.
Okay. And one thing that's always very important amongst many here is making sure that we understand who's advocating for what and the source of that support. Are you at all being compensated at all for your presence here today?
No, not other than the fine welcome I got here.
Okay, so no remuneration at all then?
Zero.
Okay.
And in fact, it works at quite a hardship, because if you can tell by my voice, I'm just barely getting over a cold. And so I think it's important enough for me to make the effort to come down here.
Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Representative Quinn.
And thank you, Mr. Williams. I really don't have a question. We had an opportunity to talk this morning, and as I think Mr. Pope and staff can make you aware, we've been trying to work with Mr. Williams and also Kent Brown, who I hope is the next speaker, to try to come up with an amendment that would get us moving forward on a bill, on an important piece of legislation that I think has a lot of potential to help us deal with this issue. But I do want to say thank you for coming. I know, speaking to Mr. Chumley and your schedule getting here this morning and how hard it was for you to get here, thank you for taking the time to be here and speak on this important issue. Very impressive. I wish we had more time to talk to you.